him are like two peas in a pod. Two bullets in a bag.
Apologies, but when Claptrap speaks, I feel my brain cells committing suicide one by one.
I almost wanted to open with this line and proceed to trash the miserable humor that went into writing some of the game's jokes, but I realized that I wouldn't be fairly representing my opinion. In all honesty, much like the original, Borderlands 2 takes itself pretty seriously. There's obviously a sarcastic, humorous overtone that tends to reveal itself in the game's non-important moments, but when it slows down and focuses, Borderlands tends to paint a tragic piece of storytelling. It's clear much of the inspiration for the world was taken from Firefly. The setting has ties to both a western and a sci-fi. Pandora itself is a world that has been left to rot by the various corporations that have tried to exploit its natural resources. You can see evidence of this inside of Borderlands. Massive technological feats that have been dilapidated due to neglect in the various vagrants and bandits that roam their presence. This massive dam, for example, houses an entire bandit city on its shoulders. It makes me wonder if they even realize what they're gathering on. And it really brings to light the tragedy of the backstory in Borderlands 2. Nearly every character has gone through some unfortunate events to end up stranded on Pandora. The bandits themselves are family of employees of corporations that came to exploit Pandora, or convicts hired to work for these same corporations. Dahl, the last corporation to house themselves on Pandora, withdraws suddenly to leave behind thousands of people to fend for themselves. This backstory presents itself everywhere. At one point in Borderlands 2, you're sent to pick up some missiles from a little girl that goes by Tiny Tina. Tina is obviously insane, much like most of Pandora's other residents, but at the same time she retains a childlike nature, which makes one wonder what the hell happened to this little girl. Through a side quest, you find that her parents were tortured and murdered by a bandit, and she was left to fend for herself. Tina spews admittedly unfunny, cringeworthy jokes that would make anyone dismiss the character at first pass, which is why it's a shame that so many people will ignore the reason why she acts the way she does. The strongly written stories don't end with the characters. Borderlands 2 gives the player much more motivation to push forward than its predecessor. I'm happy to say that unlike the original, the game has a much more cohesive and intriguing narrative. Handsome Jack happens to be one of the most well-written antagonists in recent memory. While at first coming across as childish, filled with cheaply infused humor, it doesn't take long to see that there's a reason why he acts the way he does. Borderlands portrays Jack in a number of different lights, but does a fantastic job of creating a character who is neither good nor evil. And that's what it does well. The game clearly has a sense of moral ambiguity and takes great strides to make sure that no character is just straight good or evil. Everyone has motivation behind their actions or reason to their insanity. It's really a shame that so many people are overlooking these intricate, well-written characters and stories due to something as lame as a few misplaced cultural references. The main story was largely devoid of this type of humor, instead focusing on a tragic, sarcastic tone in most of its interactions. In fact, you would probably have to look hard to find many of these jokes. The arrow in the knee joke never managed to pop up for me in the 30 hours I played through, along with many of the other common complaints people have had with the humor. None of the dialogue really made me cringe, yet the vast majority of it also didn't make me laugh or even crack a smile. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, since I don't really want my sci-fi epics to cause me to burst out laughing. Borderlands 2 opens with a miserably dull sequence in which you do a lot of walking and talking with Claptrap. It's a shame since it woefully misrepresents the rest of the game. After reaching Sanctuary, the game's main hub city, it introduces a host of new characters and picks up substantially. Gearbox promised that the variety in environments would improve from the original, and they were not joking. You'll be traveling between multiple biomes in Borderlands 2, some of which are ripe with imagination. Past the dreadful beginning area, there are plenty of ways to get around. Fast travel is just as prominent as ever and never feels cheap to use like it does in Elder Scrolls or Fallout. Vehicles are also present in Borderlands 2, but they've sadly remained unchanged from the original. It would have been nice to see some racing type events in the game similar to Rage, but you don't spend too much time in the vehicles anyway, since most of the missions require you to be on foot. Thankfully, that's where Borderlands 2 excels. The combat is now more exciting than the original, with a much larger variety of enemies and environments to shoot your way through. The improved enemy behavior makes the combat much more believable. Enemies will react to each other, causing more diverse battlefields. Whereas the beginning of the game has you doing several generic fetch quests similar to the original, later on you'll be fighting anything between your standard bandits, to a robot army, to ancient underground three-legged creatures that throw explosives at you. It's no secret that Gearbox spent far more time on enemy design this time around. The loot system remains largely similar to the original. Fans of Diablo will be pleased as there's just as much drive here to collect that next great piece of loot. Thanks to the core FPS game in Borderlands, your loot will actually change the way you play depending on what you find. These aren't just minor stats on a spreadsheet being affected, but actual changes in how weapons perform and feel. At any moment, the gameplay from the player's perspective could change radically. That being said, if you weren't a fan of the original game's loot-driven system, along with the gunplay, there's not much in Borderlands 2 that will change your mind. If I had one major complaint about the loot in Borderlands in general, it's that Gearbox doesn't seem to understand how proper multiplayer can enhance the game. Diablo 2 was played for a long time thanks to its fruitful economy. Borderlands certainly has the proper loot system to maintain this kind of economy, but doesn't offer a robust online system in the same way Battle.net did in Diablo 2. It's very easy to dismiss Borderlands 2 based on its first hour or the screenshots of the arrow in the knee joke. It's even easier to look at the game's surface characters and dialogue and say, this humor is juvenile and caters to the lowest denominator. And I won't necessarily disagree with these points. I just argue that they're putting off an entire game because of some very small flaws. I don't believe Borderlands 2 will necessarily be remembered as a masterpiece years from now, but for the time being, there are very few games that manage to pull off a great narrative while maintaining this diverse gameplay. If only Gearbox can figure out how to create a proper endgame, maybe we'd get some longevity out of the series.